The Norman and Florence Brody Family Foundation is dedicated to exploring topics of national and international importance and is proud to support Policy Watch with Doug Besheroff at the University of Maryland. From the University of Maryland, this is Policy Watch with Doug Besheroff.
The votes are in and we won.
The 2006 congressional elections granted power to the Democrats after 14 years of Republican control. Allegations of corruption, the tragedy of Hurricane Katrina, continuing difficulties in Iraq, and scandal within the Republican Party caused many to question America's Republican leadership. The voice of the people was resonant, yet its message was speculative. Was the 2006 election an endorsement of the Democrats, as well as a denouncement of the Republicans? What were the issues that compelled voters to the polls? And how will the Democrats utilize their newfound authority to confront the impending challenges of today and answer the looming questions of tomorrow? Today, we discuss the implications of the 2006 congressional elections with E.J. Dionne, syndicated columnist for The Washington Post, professor in the Foundations of Democracy and Culture at Georgetown University, and senior fellow at the Brookings Institution. And now, Doug Besheroff.
E.J. Dionne, welcome to Policy Watch and the University of Maryland.
It's great to be here.
We are delighted. So we are talking about the congressional elections of 2006, and the Democrats won big. They won the House of Representatives, they took the Senate, they won a majority of state governorships now. No Democrat running for re-election lost. What happened?
Well, I think the first thing that happened was President Bush in Iraq, and I think there's no question that when you look at the exit polling and what voters were saying beforehand, that the president and the unpopularity of the war was a decisive factor across the board. I think secondly, what you saw is a Republican Party that completely vacated the political center. And so you had moderates and independents voting Democratic at an unprecedented rate. And so the Democrats won this election because of two quite diverse groups, which creates an interesting challenge for them for the future. On the one hand, their own base, liberal, solid Democrats, turned out in very large numbers. Traditionally, Democratic groups, if anything, got more Democratic in this election. At the same time, moderates voted 3-2 Democratic, independents voted 3-2 Democratic. So this really is a coalition of the center and the left. And the Republicans got confined essentially to the right wing of the country, not exclusively, but largely on the right.
Well, let's go back to Iraq for a second. 2/3 of the American people think the war now is a mistake. I think almost as many think we're losing the war and want us to leave right away.
There was a group of Americans who voted Democratic who want to leave yesterday and would leave as rapidly as possible. There's another group, I think, that is not exactly sure that they're for a timetable, but they sure want to be on their way out of there. And I think the challenge for Democrats on that front is that a lot of voters voted for them to nudge us out of Iraq. But they don't want to be in a position, I think, to confront that old stab in the back theory, that this was a Republican policy pursued by a Republican president, and I think the Democrats do not want a situation where the troops are pushed out and then the Republicans ex post facto say, see, the Democrats messed up this war. I think that's very hard because even people who supported the war, I think, now believe that it was executed badly and that there not enough troops were sent in the first place, the planning was poor. I think that's a very widely held view, including by people who were strong supporters of the war.
Do the Democrats do hearings and investigations? What are they going to do to nudge us out of Iraq?
Well, I think you're seeing some interesting developments with the Baker-Hamilton Commission. And it appears that the Baker-Hamilton Commission is going to be a nudge and not a push, that there's some peculiar kind of compromise where there won't be a date set, but the implication will be that Americans will be on their way out over some period of time. But if you take the Democratic positions in their totality, virtually all of them, I suppose Senator Lieberman, who was elected as an independent, is an exception, but virtually all of them are saying we have to figure out how to get out of there at the lowest possible cost to us and the Iraqis.
I bet John Kerry is wishing the presidential election had been in 06 and not 04.
Very much so, and as long as he didn't tell that joke, you know, that's it.
Let me ask you to put your political science scientist hat on for a second. So another way to look at what happened in November '06 is the electorate telling the president, who actually has 2 more years and in some respects has unfettered military authority to keep this war going, the electorate telling the president, back off.
I also think it's a signal to the moderates in the Arab world who have said quietly they don't really want Americans to go, that there is a simple impatience on the part of Americans. I forgot who it was who pointed out that all the wars we have won have lasted 4 years or less. And I think that the American people will give their strong support to a war if they believe the cause is just and if they believe it's being fought well and effectively. And that a democratic country is going to get very impatient over the loss of life and the loss of treasure, but particularly the loss of life in a war that is not going well. And again, I think one of the big mistakes the administration made is not realizing that it did not have a blank check for this war, that it needed to make progress very quickly, because eventually Americans were going to say, we don't see how or where this ends, and we don't want to continue to send our troops over there.
You also had echoes of economic insecurity, and this is sort of an odd one. The economy is strong, unemployment is low, and yet there is this sense, I think it was half of the voters said the economy, let me read it, not good or poor. What's that story all about?
You know, what was really fascinating about this election is the Republicans in October were desperate to get people to vote on the economy because they didn't want them to vote on Iraq. And if you looked at the exit polls, they got their wish. About 40% of the Americans said the economy was very important to them, but they voted Democratic by 3-2. And what appears to me to be the case is that voters who are hurting or unhappy voted on the economy, and that voters who are not hurting and not unhappy about the economy voted more on Iraq. And so it turned out to be the worst of both possible worlds for the Republicans. There's a great book that I'm plugging, and I can do that, it's not mine, by a young scholar called Jacob Hacker at Yale called The Great Risk Shift. And I think he's really put his finger on something very important. He argues that the risk in the American economy is being shifted away from the corporation and the government and toward the individual. And, you know, you can see a number of examples of that. We counted on our employers for a long time to pay most of the cost of health care. The other point Jacob makes is that in the most recent 10 years, there's a much larger variation in people's incomes. The average person might have their income go as high as 60 and drop to 30,000 a year. Now the swing is 60 down to 15. I think all those factors show that this is not an economic catastrophe akin to the Great Depression. And indeed, as you said, the unemployment rate's low, the inflation rate's low, but there is a lot of genuine insecurity. The voters who are not happy about the economy are not making up what they feel.
I think I'd add something to that, though. Many of those unemployed Americans were in places like Missouri, Indiana. They were in the great Midwest, which used to be a center of Republican electoral power. And so those places, Ohio,
I think, is the particularly important case where we all know how important Ohio was in the 2004 election. Representative Sherrod Brown ran on a very strong economic nationalist platform with very strong advertisements about the outsourcing of jobs, and that had a lot of resonance. In Ohio, 20% of the people, I think it's around 20%, it may be like 18% of the people who voted for President Bush for switch to Sherrod Brown this time. I think, there are a lot of things going on in Ohio. There were a lot of Republican corruption scandals as well as the national tide. But still, I think the economy there was a mess.
Let's go to the Congress as an institution for a moment. 75% of the American people disapproved of the Congress?
Where did the rest come from?
Well, yes, but also, and yet a third of those 75% still voted for the incumbent Republicans, because the vote was about 51-47 or something, wasn't it? Something like that?
Well, most elections, incumbents win. And even in this election with a big turnover, most incumbents running for re-election got re-elected. Secondly, you had gerrymandering. I mean, a year ago, a lot of people were saying Democrats can't possibly take the Congress because these seats were so carefully crafted that you know, the Democrats can't win even if they have a great election. You know, with the best metaphor appropriate given the role that Katrina played, I think, in creating this result, is that the Republicans thought they had built levees for a Class 4 hurricane, and a Class 5 hurricane hit them.
In 1994, it felt as if the Democrats had run out of steam. There were corruption scandals and so forth. Are we just looking at a rule that says every 10, 14, 18 years, the ruling party, this happened in Britain, the ruling party runs out of steam?
It took the Republicans only 12 years to do what it took the Democrats 40 years to do.
Fair enough. Well, the Republicans are fast learners, right?
No, I think there is a natural cycle in politics, although it's never clear how long it's going to last. I mean, you know, the Democrats from 32 to 52 held the presidency, for example, and they had that long run in the House. But there were plenty of reasons for people to be mad at Congress, and it didn't help the Republicans at capping all this off after the troubles with Tom DeLay and the Abramoff scandal. And, you know, we could
Mark Foley.
Then, well, I was going to say, after all that, then came Mark Foley in the last 3 weeks of the election. And I'm still struck the weekend that the Foley story broke. The first impulse of the Republican leadership was not even to figure out how can we tell the same story, putting aside the merits of whatever story they would have told. They immediately started blaming each other. And when internal squabbles become more important to you than winning an election that's 3 weeks down the road, you know you've reached the end of the road.
This could also be considered just a straight out-and-out anti-Bush vote. People don't think this administration or the Bush administration is very competent.
You know, I would take it back to 2004. Bush won a narrow margin. I believe in 2004 there were two majorities in the country, a narrow majority that wanted to fire Bush and a narrow majority that just couldn't get to John Kerry. And the Bush campaign very effectively mobilized that second narrow majority. And I think 4 or 5% of the Bush vote were really people who decided they trusted Bush a little bit more after 9/11 than they did John Kerry in those circumstances. But they never had strong support. But immediately coming out of the box, the president decided he had a mandate. So, and he had a mandate to do what? To partially privatize Social Security. Well, if my theory about, you know, following Jacob Hacker about the great risk shift is right, privatizing Social Security was just not going to be popular in this climate, and it forced the president to spend a long time talking down his own economy, because if Social Security is in crisis, there must be some underlying problem with the economy. So it was kind of indirectly doing that. Then came the Terry Schiavo decision, which I think was an enormous mistake and began the process of eroding the Republican strength. You had the month of August dominated, I think it's fair to say, dominated by the question of will Karl Rove be indicted or not. It turned out he wasn't. And then you have Katrina at the end of all of that. And that I think Katrina was a terrible blow because, you know, historically people would say, well, we elect the Democrats to pass some good things and we elect the Republicans to run it right. Well, they didn't run it right in Katrina, and there was this outrage in the country, and you couldn't spin the story. It was right there on everybody's television sets, and I was struck by the outrage of the reporters on the scene. I happen to know some of those reporters are not liberals at all. They were just angry on behalf of the people who were suffering, and it was a natural and proper reaction, and it conveyed to the whole country.
All that makes sense to me. The one thing that I'm struck by that I can't get my arms around is your comments about Social Security. The Republicans took an even higher percentage of the elderly vote this time round than they did last time. Social Security used to be called the third rail of American politics. It looks as if the Republicans didn't pay for challenging the basic fundamentals of the system.
Well, they didn't necessarily pay among the elderly. I mean, they touched it and got burned a year later in this case. Two things about the elderly vote. It is a very interesting fact that the elderly seemed not to swing as heavily. Actually, the strongest Democratic group are under 30s. Americans under 30 voted 60% Democratic, which may tell you something about where things are going. But this generation of elderly Americans is different from the previous generation because while there are, and I know some of them are here with us tonight, still people from the New Deal generation, God bless each and every one of them. On the whole, this new generation of elderly is more from the Eisenhower and later generation. It is a more conservative generation politically than the Roosevelt-Truman generation was. So I think that has something to do with it.
And more affluent.
And a lot of yes, more affluent. And then I think there's going to be a sort of revisiting of the Medicare drug benefit. I think in the end, some elderly people are mad about it and don't like it, and some elderly people have benefited from it, and we haven't figured out what those percentages are. I talked to a Republican pollster who wanted the party to run on the drug benefit, who was arguing, look, there's a significant number of people out there who benefited from this, and he said that so many Republicans said, oh, the thing costs too much money, we shouldn't have passed it, that he couldn't persuade them to run on the very thing that they had passed in order to win votes from the elderly. That was also, I think, part of the dysfunction inside the party this year. That sort of thing is the sort of story you usually hear about Democrats, but you heard a lot of those stories about Republicans this year.
I don't remember whether the drug benefit was $1 trillion or not, but that sounds like a nice round number.
Yes.
And I don't think the Republicans got a single vote for spending $1 trillion. So you wrote this book a few years ago called Why Americans Hate Politics. And you mentioned a moment ago, self-identified Republicans, I think 90% of them voted Republican. Self-identified Democrats, about 90% voted Democratic. It was the middle that switched. In 2004, about 50-50 on the independents for Republicans and Democrats, and this time around, 57% or whatever of independents voted Democratic. So, was your book proven correct?
Doesn't everybody think their book is proven correct? No, I always joke that given the title, that book is a counter-indicator. If things are really bad, that book sells better. But, you know, the core thesis of the book, I think, right now really does look pretty good given what the mood is, because the core thesis was that Americans don't like ideological, harsh ideological politics. They like problem-solving politics. Arthur Schlesinger Jr. talked about the politics of remedy. And I think when one looks back to something like the New Deal, or indeed the most successful programs pushed by Lyndon Johnson, everybody says those were liberal programs. Really, there was problem-solving programs. Social Security solved the problem of deep poverty for a lot of elderly Americans. Medicare solved the problem of their difficulty in getting health care. The GI Bill created enormous upward mobility in our country. And you can go down a list of areas where government, without necessarily being terribly intrusive, could actually make a substantial difference in the lives of people and increase their chances of upward mobility. I still think that's what people are looking for in government. So I don't think Americans like us spending all our time arguing about various social issues. I think they are looking for problem-solving government. I think for the Republicans, the loss of those moderates is going to be a real problem, because one thing moderate Republicans used to be about is problem solving, which is why so many of them became governors and were quite effective as governors. And I think the more you drive the moderates out of the Republican Party, the more the Republicans are going to move away from that kind of politics. In the meantime, I think Democrats have a very strong incentive to emphasize problem-solving politics, because I think that is what can unite their left and a lot in this new center that supports them.
Now that the Democrats have the power, they have the opportunity to construct either the same or a new approach to governing. And you've written about a center-left coalition of problem solvers. They could do that, or they could just keep their heads down for another 2 years and hope they get the whole pie in 2008, right?
Right, but I don't think they can fully keep their heads down. I mean, I think they need to think both in terms of 2 years and 10 years. 2 years because this coalition has to survive, and they would like to elect a president. And there's a limit to how much they can accomplish with 49 Republicans in the Senate and President Bush with a veto pen. On the other hand, they need to think in terms of 10 years, because a lot of these problems won't be solved quickly. A lot of what's going to have to be done will require a lot of national discussion and debate. I think one of the things they can do, which has not been done enough in Congress in these 12 years, and I think the Republicans actually could have done this more than they did, is use the whole process of congressional hearings and the attention you can get with power to shine a light on some real problems. And you don't necessarily produce some vast 20-point legislative program immediately, but you begin to shape the public conversation where people start focusing on a particular problem, saying, yes, we need to solve that, and what do we need to do about it? So I think short term they have to hold power, and then long term they have to make some real progress on some of these problems we've talked about.
And the Republicans really didn't do the public education side of their power. They didn't hold that many hearings. There weren't that many informative hearings. last question before we take questions from the audience. So, in their heart of hearts, you mentioned that the Democrats took the Senate by the narrowest of margins. You think they would have preferred to not control the Senate? Forget about all the Democratic senators who are going to enjoy being chairman of committee.
Oh, I absolutely think they're better off taking the Senate. Number one, a whole bunch of rather extreme federal judges simply won't go through, and that's a really big deal. Secondly, there is at least the possibility of passing two-house legislation. I mean, with the House alone, you face the prospect of passing a bill and having it go over the Senate and never get out of committee. In this case, even if the Democrats lose a fight on the Senate floor, they can force a debate. They can actually force Republicans to kill proposals. And in these 2 years, I think the Democrats will be shrewd enough not to put a lot of unpopular proposals on the Senate floor. And then if they manage to pass both houses, it's a challenge to President Bush, either sign this thing, the minimum wage, increasing help for students through student loans, whatever the program is, sign it, and then we'll have a nice bipartisan agreement, or veto it, and you're not helping students and you're not helping low-wage workers. So I think they are much better off with two houses rather than one. And I've always believed it's a bad idea not to trust yourself so that you don't really want to give yourself power. I don't think that shows any self-confidence.
On that note, it's time to turn to our audience for questions. Let me remind you that if you want to send us your comments or questions yourselves, you can reach us at PolicyWatch at UMD for University of Maryland .edu. That's PolicyWatch at University of Maryland.edu.
I have a question about reality. You've already mentioned that after Bush realized the results of the election, he renominated 6 conservative judges. He also is going to push the Congress to approve John Bolton as UN ambassador. He didn't nominate him, but his Secretary of HHS has nominated an Assistant Secretary for Population Affairs who not only is anti-abortion, he's anti-family planning. Is it going to be possible for the Congress to work with this president, or are we in gridlock?
I think there is going to be a division of opinion inside the White House. At least my reading of the tea leaves right now is there is one strategy which people are linking to Karl Rove, which says, that the president should stay on the conservative side of things, build up primarily to rebuild conservative strength for the 2008 election and govern in that way. I think there's another part of the administration, I think Josh Bolton, not to be confused with, the chief of staff, not to be confused with John Bolton, seems more interested in doing deals. I think the Treasury Secretary is of that mind. Now, I could have the internal forces wrong, but I think I have the argument right in terms of what's happening inside the White House, because I think you're absolutely right. If those particular steps become emblematic of the way President Bush is going to govern for the next 2 years, Katie bar the door. There will not be a lot of comedy and concord in Washington, D.C. Thank you.
So many people are dissatisfied with their lack of health care or quality of it. What do you think might happen these 2 years while Bush is still president? And then, if Hillary is nominated and elected, what is Hillary's stance going to be on health care after the fiasco when Bill was president?
If Hillary is nominated or elected, she's going to do it really differently from the last time. That's the one thing I am absolutely sure of. I think in the long run, there are 2 potential approaches that could work. One is slowly filling these holes so that you get the number of uninsured down gradually over a period of time with a mix of government actions, but mostly focused on government. There's another proposal floating around, which is to use federal money to provide state incentives to create 50 state plans. I mean, I'm intrigued by what happened in Massachusetts, and I'm not sure that plan will work, but it was kind of exciting to see a state take this on the way Massachusetts did. And if Utah wants a little bit more of a market-oriented plan, and Bernie Sanders' Vermont wants to have a somewhat more social democratic plan, let them go for it and see what works, but with the imperative that you cover everybody. I don't know which of those is going to work, and even with the state approach, you're going to need a very strong federal role. But it can't stay the same because employers are going to keep dropping people. I just think that's inevitable as these costs rise, and we're just not going to accept as a country having the number of uninsured just keep ratcheting up. But I hope you keep fighting because it'll come quicker. So thank you.
But what about Hillary? How will she play into this?
Oh, I think if she is elected, this will be, I think this is a real commitment for her. In other words, I don't think it was an accident that she ended up with this issue. I don't think this has ever left her. She's been cautious about it because she got burned so badly the first time around. But if she were elected, I bet she'll try again. And again, as I said, I think she'll do it differently.
E.J., thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you.
This program was produced by the University of Maryland, which is solely responsible for its content. The Norman and Florence Brody Family Foundation is dedicated to exploring topics of national and international importance and is proud to support Policy Watch with Doug Besheroff at the University of Maryland.